Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan, either in person or online. Thank you for joining today's event. My name is Khaldun Azhari. I'm a moderator of this event. And our guest speaker today is Professor Koichiro Tanaka. He came here before a few times. And Tanaka-san has spoke in the club, I think, last year.
Maybe 2-3 years ago.
2-3 years ago, mostly about energy issues. And he is former political affairs officer at the United Nations Special Mission to Afghanistan, very related to our event today. And also had worked under the Ambassador Vendrell and Brahimi there. Also, Tanaka-san also monitored Afghani elections in the Loya Jirga,
Yeah.
The Legal Assembly. He was a member of the Japanese Cabinet Secretary's Ad Hoc Committee on Assistance to Afghanistan in 2010. Of course, we all know the developments in recent days about Afghanistan. Yesterday there was an explosion in the airport area. Every day carries a new development. And the situation is everything but clear. And it seems that the Taliban has been trying to speak nicely, but work or act harshly against certain elements in the country. I think more and more issues will appear, and today Tanaka-san will explain to us all the questions we have in mind about the situation there. Without a further ado, Tanaka-san, please start the presentation, and we will have a Q&A after maybe 20 minutes or so. Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you, Azhari-san, for the kind introduction. And it's always a real honor and pleasure to be back here, have an opportunity to present my views on the events. Well, this time it's going to be Afghanistan, a country that I worked for quite a long time, but especially during the period of 1999 to 2001. I was stationed in Islamabad working for the United Nations Special Mission to Afghanistan, UNSMA, UNSMA we called it, and have been dealing with the political solution for Afghanistan between the Taliban elements and the former Islamic State of Afghanistan. Unfortunately, that sort of a negotiation did not work, and eventually 9/11 happened, and ever since then we've been working on how to build a new Afghanistan and stable and restore stability and peace back into that country. Now today, I would like to address the issues related to Afghanistan and also sort of a political implication or geopolitical implication of what it may mean even for us. But initially, I will have several issues that I'd like to draw your attention to. Now, the U.S. president has been, repeatedly saying that Afghanistan, or their mission in Afghanistan, was not supposed to be a nation building or state building, whatever he refers to. But even himself does refer to a clause to make sure Al-Qaeda could not use Afghanistan as a base from which to attack us again. End of clause. Now, that refers to what George W. Bush said back in April 2002, that we are helping to rebuild Afghanistan. So even though the current president of the United States strongly believes that the mission of the U.S. forces in Afghanistan did not include nation building, his predecessor did say that it is part of their mission. If it's not the sole mission, if it's not the sole objective of the mission, it is part of the mission. And even under President Barack Obama, when the surge of U.S. troops happened in Afghanistan, the forces over there were supposed to clear, hold, and build. And build, I mean build meaning how to build a stability or restore stability over there. So whatever the current president wants to tell the United States citizens and his voters, there was a mission by the United States, clearly stated by his predecessors, or even acknowledged partially by himself, that the state building or nation building in Afghanistan was part of their issue. So being reminded of that, what went wrong? Of course, variety of issues and also problems here and there, not some internal, some external, and some co-related, interrelated, and so this is not the only part of it, and we can all argue in length for hours of what went wrong and what was the root cause of today's failure and the defeat of so-called U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Problem is, we cannot turn the clock around. We cannot undo this. The things that happened over this current few weeks, have all managed to destroy whatever has been achieved over there. So it is too late to talk about this. But just for the record, I would just like to say that it's not only about the failure on the Afghan government or the Afghan National Army, that they were incapable of defending the country. It was also the fault of the US, NATO, and also the international donors equally that had a role in today's unwanted results in Afghanistan. Now, we are seeing the resurgence of Taliban, and also that the Taliban had already occupied Kabul, or maybe 95% of the total landscape of Afghanistan. We are now somehow watching to see, monitoring what's going to happen next. The likeliness is that they would establish a government on their own. Even though there are elements from the former government or the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan that are trying to negotiate with the Taliban leadership, who are some of the representatives in Kabul, on how to form a new government. I mean, these talks have been ongoing under the sponsorship of the state of Qatar and also by the guidance of the United States Special Envoy, Zalmay Khalilzad, in Doha, Qatar. But now it's taking place over there in Kabul. Now, regardless of what the outcome of that discussions may be, there is one thing that we shouldn't forget, that the Taliban may be different from the year when they were expelled from Afghanistan or from their leadership in Afghanistan back in 2001. But my reading and also my observation tells me, if it's correct, that they haven't changed as much as they want to, or as much as they are preaching at this moment. And one thing to remember is that Taliban is not a monolithic entity. It is an aggregation of ulemas, Islamic scholars, commanders, combatants, but also jihadists, fugitives, and bandits, and so on and so forth. So there are many elements, many segments, multiple segments that constitute the Taliban. They may have one or two ideas that unite them together, are the stated objectives. And number one, liberalizing or the liberalization of Afghanistan from the invaders, or freeing the Afghanistan from the invaders or the invading foreign forces like the United States. Second point, establishing or re-establishing the Islamic Emirate and building a society under the rule of Sharia. Okay? So these were the two objectives that bind the elements, multiple elements within the so-called Taliban movement together. Now, point number one, freeing Afghanistan from the invaders are almost done. Possibly by the end of this month, or slightly beyond that maybe. From September 2021, it's likely that the first bond is to disappear because it's almost done. It's done. It's a done deal now. So what's going to put the what is going to be the gist that would bind the multiple factions within the Taliban together, or the fighters together, would be the second part, meaning building a society ruled under Sharia law. reestablishing the Islamic Emirate. So for that reason, I strongly believe that there is very little room for the Taliban movement to relinquish their claim to rule Afghanistan under Sharia. And not only that, it would be extremely difficult for the leadership to adopt an interpretation of the Sharia which may be more, say, loose or isn't in the value of maybe human rights, or especially human rights vis-a-vis the women. So one thing that the Taliban would like to change, but eventually would be unlikely to change themselves, is this point. Once they set foot in this arena, once they touch this point, they will no longer be sort of a unified idea of how to put them together. Multiple factions, multiple ideas, multiple interests. One point that would remain until beyond September 2021 is this point, application of Sharia, and that is the point. Okay, and people may be considering there may be a revolt against the Taliban nationwide, possibly, or at least from the Panjshir Valley, where Commander Ahmad Shah Massoud once fought against the Soviets and later against the Taliban movement. But the problem is it's quite different from the 1990s or even from the 1980s. There is no actual resistance strong enough to counter the Taliban movement or the former warlords. The reason is quite simple, because today the former warlords have all lost their power. They do not hold that sort of a strong private army that they used to during the Civil War, the years of the Civil War. And that is because the DDR program, the dismantling or the disarming and dismantling and rehabilitation, reintegration of the fighters, combatants into the society, DDR program that was sponsored by the Japanese government, miraculously went well during the early 2000s, and eventually had, given the warlords no other choice than to relinquish their private armies and their arms that they had in hand. So there is no strong enough rebellion or resistance against the Taliban forces today. Second point is, unlike the 80s or the 90s, now today the Taliban has a monopoly of weapon systems, advanced weapon systems that was provided by the US and NATO forces for the Afghan National Army and police. Now they have confiscated all that from the depots, and that they have everything in their hands. Whilst the former warlords or any private army or any dissident faction that may remain inside the country does not have the privilege to use that or to own that. So there is a total monopoly of weapons on the side of the Taliban. And the supply route is all controlled today by the Taliban. The advancement of the Taliban forces first towards the west happened in Islam Kala. That's a that's a border point, crossing point with Iran. They took over the control of Islam Kala. Then they advanced towards the north, and they have shut down and also placed under their control Heratan and other locations which are the crossing points for Central Asia. So whatever the so-called Northern Alliance or the United Front for the Salvation of Afghanistan, which used to exist in the past, would want to do today, there is no supply route for them to get additional ammunition or any even food and basic materials to sustain their living. And that is totally different from what was happening in up until 2001. And There had been several countries in the region or close to Afghanistan that were supportive of the resistance against Taliban in the 1990s, namely Russia, Iran, and some Western countries that they did not want to be named, and possibly India. All of them, as of today, well, maybe with the exception of India, but Russia and Iran in particular are now in much better relationship with the Taliban than as compared to their relationship back in the 1990s. They have their line of communication, they have some sort of an agreement with the Taliban, and that is totally different. So the anti-Taliban forces could not depend on support from them either. So it's totally different on the ground of what's going to happen. And what comes next? But the Taliban, even though they have now control over Kabul and the rest of the country, they are going to run in trouble. The likeliness is quite high, is that they don't still know how to run a government. They may claim that they have control over certain ministries, certain central urban centers, certain army garrisons, but that doesn't provide them automatically that they are the government or the functioning government. Second point is that when they see that once the West have evacuated all the necessary personnel to be out from Kabul or from Afghanistan, they will turn harshly against the Taliban activity. So they will start coming after them. Today, they are still nuanced in what they say about the Taliban or what is happening in Kabul and other cities and in rural areas because they haven't conducted fully successfully the evacuation of their personnel. So in a sense, they are taken hostage. So they know that they would run into trouble if they still want to conduct this exodus program successfully. But once that is done, or if it is totally interrupted by the Taliban, then they will come after the Taliban in a very harsh manner. But the Taliban have their own way of countering that sort of an argument. We rule and you provide, meaning that we are the rulers. I mean, we have now the control of the country, but we are in need, or the people are in need, so you provide for us, or you provide for them. And this is sort of an old manner that the Taliban adopted during the 1990s. Maybe they might have been different in the very early stage when they emerged around the city of Kandahar in 94. But later their attitude turned like that. Third point is that they would revert to the old rhetoric and habit, is that you have the obligation, you meaning us, the international community, donors, have the obligation to provide the Afghans, so help the Afghans. Because we fought against the Soviets, we tarnished them, and you should be thankful for us, and that for that sense, you need to help the Afghans. And not to forget the narco economy. If they are not sufficiently provided aid from the international community, they would just exceed on their narcotic business, which is quite lucrative, but still may not be enough to run the entire country. So eventually, they will reveal their original nature, which is their rhetoric again. The suffering of the Afghan people is happening because the West in particular, or the international community as a whole, or the West in particular, is against Afghanistan and Islam. So that is likely to happen within the month to come. And what are we supposed to do? Japan and the international community, we could at least at the moment concentrate our efforts in coordinating the efforts to secure the safe evacuation programs. But we see and we hear that there has been a major disruption of the operation because of the 2 bombings that happened last night. And it is going to be even more difficult operation now that this sort of a disruption and also a security concern is rising. Second point, we still need to, from a humanitarian point of view, supply the Afghans and alleviate the miseries, the possible miseries that may happen to them humanitarian assistance is a must. And we also need to persuade the Taliban. I don't think that they have the listening ears for us, but we need to persuade the Taliban to come to a mutually agreeable negotiated settlement with the former government officials. Would that bring democracy back to Afghanistan? It's unlikely, but it's still better than having a bloody war with the former government elements and the Taliban movement. The international community could apply sanctions. There's more room for sanctions, but who's to suffer? The Taliban has been placed under UN sanctions since 1989. It was strengthened later, but still, they have been placed under individually and also as an organization, as a movement, they have been placed under UN sanctions. But that didn't hurt. It may hurt the population. If we apply more sanctions, that would end to the misery or add to the misery of the Afghans, local Afghans. So it's going to be a dilemma. We are facing a dilemma. And we could talk to the Taliban, or we could keep on talking to the Taliban in a hope that one day they may come to their senses, or at least they may want to change, hoping that they would want to change. But for that to happen, we need to make a choice. It's going to be a critical dialogue or a constructive engagement. If they act in a way that they are going to change, it may be referred to as a constructive engagement. But they may take it as a critical dialogue, which they don't like. They are not used to be criticized, and that is the point. Now, the last point I'd like to talk about is the geopolitical impact of how this is going to work, or how it's going to impact the region and beyond. Now, this is a relationship charted by, or represented by lines and arrows, and also colors, and also double lines and dotted lines. Green line it would refer to a very strong and cordial relationship. The dotted blue double lines are relatively good or even normal diplomatic relationships. And not to forget, the red arrow lines with both arrows are the represent the conflict of interests and also enmity, rivalry, and that sort of stuff. Now, we've been seeing in the past 20 years gradually that Afghanistan have moved much, much closer to India under the government of Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, which caused a concern for Pakistan, first of all. They wanted to see Afghanistan or use Afghanistan as their strategic depth against India, which might have been the case in the 90s, but have changed dramatically against them after the collapse of the Taliban regime. So the connection between, or the bind between Afghanistan's government of Islamic Republic and India grew stronger, and that had squeezed Pakistan from the north and south. It was caught in between. But that doesn't benefit the interest of China, which has become a strong ally to Pakistan, much stronger ally to Pakistan than it was back in 2001. And China, although it maintained a cordial relationship with the government of the Islamic Republic, they considered that the India-Afghanistan nexus would bring disadvantage for the Chinese government or the Chinese geopolitical interest in Afghanistan and also in the Central Asian states. India would use or have a connection to Afghanistan, not directly, but through Iran, and from Iran to Afghanistan and towards, again, to the north, to the Central Asian republics, which again would be a sort of a ground for competition between the Indians and the Chinese. And all this was happening. And added to that, in recent years, when the Chinese-American competition grew much stronger and harshly here in the Pacifics, but not only in the Pacifics, also in around the Indian Ocean, and this initiative, the so-called initiative of the Free Indo-Pacific region arose, that became another concern for the Chinese. Now they want to curtail the Indian influence in the Central Asian republics, as well as in the western part of China. Well, the geographical connection between Afghanistan and China is confined to one location, the Wakhan corridor, which is around only 40 miles, and also it's a very mountainous region, so it's not that, say, useful for any sort of an operation besides a terrorist operation. But now that the Indians may have an access to Afghanistan and also to Central Asia, and that would also put Pakistan's geopolitical advantage in jeopardy, the Chinese would want, or at least when they saw that the Taliban was on the rise, they have changed their attitudes. Previously, the Chinese were very concerned about the Muslim minorities, especially the Uyghur movements, that the separatists would be harbored under the Taliban or by Al-Qaeda inside Afghanistan. That was their attitude during the 1990s. So they were quite skeptical of what the Taliban may do. Today, that sort of a concern still remains, even though the Taliban has given the Chinese sort of an assurance that they would not allow Afghanistan as a launching pad to attack other countries. But still, the Chinese opted to have a better relationship with the Taliban for one reason, because of the strategic competition, not only between India and Pakistan, between India and China, but also the Quad, the alliance between the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. In order to break that sort of a confinement from the West, or the western part of China, India's advantage in the region that had been, secured through its relationship, India's strong relationship with the Afghan government, is now gone. So having a Taliban movement in power in Afghanistan would provide them sort of an advantage which did not exist, and also be able to curtail any presence of the Indians in Central Asia through Afghanistan. So this is a very different picture that we are going to see in West Asia, Central Asia, and South Asia. And one reason that I believe that the Chinese are really accommodating the Taliban movement is because they see this geopolitical advantage, which didn't exist in the past 20 years. And I'll stop here. I think I talked too much.
Thank you for the insights. I have received some questions online, but we start with the floor. If anybody has a question, please raise your hand and proceed the mic. Any question? Peter?
It's Peter Langen at the South China Morning Post. I wanted to ask you, Professor, about the some of the reports that were written over many, many years by the Special Investigation called CIGAR.
CIGAR, yes, the American.
The American, council that was set up to sort of monitor, be a watchdog, if you like, for American investment and activities in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. If you go back and look at those reports over many, many, many years, one of the things they keep highlighting is endemic corruption. So much so that you reach a point where it seems like the US and its allies dealing with supposedly the Afghan government was actually dealing with what seemed like a whole collection of organized crime families in terms of the amounts of money being siphoned away into this criminal activities over and above the narco economy. But could you comment on how much of a factor was this in the failure of the US and its allies in its reconstruction efforts? You know, putting aside the questions about the military activities, but I think it was close to 150 billion US dollars were invested in Afghanistan purely on reconstruction, yet most of this just seems to have failed. So could you comment on that role of corruption in Afghanistan? Thank you.
Yeah, yes. Well, thank you for the excellent question. I do subscribe that corruption is a major cause of how the Afghan government failed in, garnering support from the public, or the ordinary Afghans. But at the same time, I would like to point out that corruption, partially was homegrown, but also it was aggravated by the presence of the foreign forces, especially the US forces, when they were handing out cash to local leaders, chieftains, and other unwanted or unholy individuals who might have been the Taliban, or who might have been siphoning the money directly to the Taliban or other insurgency movements. And this was done under the guise of the PRTs, the Provincial Reconstruction Teams. This was meant initially as a design to garner support from the public and to strengthen the governance of the Afghan government. So the international forces and the community, the civilian elements as well, were working in tandem to provide necessary assistance to the rural areas, especially to the rural areas. And when they went in, forces like, Japanese forces were not there, so the Japanese team were embedded inside the, I forgot which country, but it was one of the European, smaller European countries that we worked together with. But there have been others, Norwegians, Swedish, and Germans, Italians, Turks, and everybody were there. And also the Americans were there. One typical action or activity that the Americans were really good at was to swiftly move through the villages and swiftly allocate the money that they were handed over from their bosses or the commanders. And they had been so proud of, those people who had been working for the PRT team were so proud that they were doing it exactly right and that they were buying loyalty of the locals so that they would not turn against the international forces, they won't turn against the Afghan government. But they actually had no idea of who they were talking to. They were so maybe blind or so naive in, considering that they are genuine citizens, with a hope that they are welcoming the U.S. forces and other foreigners, that they are there to assist the Afghans. But they were wrong. And it was a very, very, bad habit, I'd rather say, that it was left untouched until Seagar and other reporters or other systems came to notice it and also to report it. So, problem, corruption, yes, but it was also, put it under a severe condition, as though that nobody would come after them, because of the huge amount of money that was siphoned by the international forces, especially the American forces. And that is one reason that I believe that the reconstruction, the money that was supposed to be utilized for reconstruction, was not there when it was supposed to. And it was on the contrary, used to strengthen the Taliban movement or other insurgents.
Thank you. I have a few questions online about China. Actually, two members asked about China, almost same questions, so I will just read them. First one is from Dennis Normail, he's former president of the club. He asks, there are indications China will provide DOA, development assistance to Afghanistan through its Belt and Road Initiative. Will Japan consider providing development assistance to the new government? And similar question to some extent that China hopes to extend also its Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, to Afghanistan. What would be the impact of better transport and other infrastructure links between Afghanistan and the outside world from this assistance? Thank you. It's this question from Anthony Rowley, South China Morning Post. Thanks.
Okay, well, yeah. How would Japan provide the Afghans? Well, it's a good question. At the moment, I don't foresee any moment that we are going to launch the aid programs, apart from the humanitarian assistances. The lack or the absence of a legitimate Afghan government, well, legally or technically, would not allow the Japanese government to move forward with any sort of a development plan. Of course, all the JICA elements and staff have been removed, hopefully been removed by now. I'm not quite sure yet, because maybe they're still stranded in Kabul airport or in the surroundings. But there is no room for relaunching that project or programs until there is a internationally recognized Afghan government, for sure. But that doesn't apply to humanitarian aid, which may happen in case of need. Now, how I see the BRI, I don't see the Chinese that eager to include Afghanistan in part of their BRI programs. BRI runs through, especially on land, more towards the north of Afghanistan, meaning Central Asia, entering basically Iran and then moving westwards. That was the original design, as I understand. Maybe they might have sort of a, say, short route inside Afghanistan, which that doesn't mean that it's going to be a significant part of their portion of their transit route. BRI itself, I believe, has much less to do with Afghanistan itself. Some talk about, there are talks about the a mass of natural resources that Afghanistan may hold. It was the United States Geographical Studies Center, USGS, that had openly stated back in the about 12 years ago or 13 years ago, started talking about the huge amount of those minerals and mines and other resources. Afghanistan may have a lot of those resources. Problem is it going to be sort of a source that the outsiders, foreigners, be capable of tapping? If Afghanistan is going to be ruled by the Taliban, and if they are going to apply Sharia as their law, the basic law of governing, natural resources would be placed under strict government control or national control, and there would be less room for concessions. In Islam, there is an understanding or teaching that is referred to as afal. Meaning, the original meaning is booty, or what do we call it? Trophy of war, or war trophy. And these resources are supposed to be divided among the society equally. And it would give very little room for external factors, like foreigners, or non-believers, like the Chinese. or even us, to tap into. This is one reason in the Middle East, especially in the Middle East, we see that the natural resources, oil and gas, has been nationalized. Previously, from the 1930s, or in Iran, the case of Iran since 1908, it was controlled under a concession agreement by the British, the Americans, and others. Today, they are nationalized. I mean, the strict understanding or the interpretation of Sharia would not allow an easy access for the Chinese to tap into these natural resources. And that is how I see the conditions.
I just received a question from Andy Sharp of Nikkei Asia, also about China, so I'm just keeping in the same topic. He asked, or how exactly do you think China will play the situation to its advantage? Do you think it will bid its time and work quietly with the Taliban to build its influence and gain access to the resources? Or will it come out swinging with a quick recognition of a Taliban government and offer loan and investment, etc., to Afghanistan? Just in the same way.
Well, at least we've seen that the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, and several others using this opportunity to, well, condemn the United States and also to place pressure on the U.S. activities, military activities in the region, or its, say, intention to so enforce or to impose its style of democracy over others. Well, I mean, they're taking this opportunity, no doubt about that. But beyond that, well, at least for now, it's quite comfortable for the Chinese to see that Afghanistan has been liberated from the Americans, that there is no presence of the Americans, and also liberated from the influence of the Indians. So, and it's going to be likely to be controlled by a faction that is close to Pakistan, so indirectly by China. So, beyond that, I do not believe that the Chinese would, well, repeat the same mistake that the Soviet forces have done, or the communist regime back in the 1980s had done, and also from 2001 beyond, that the Americans and the West have done in Afghanistan, that they would come to organize and also to influence the Afghans to see that they, and also in order to establish a government of their choice. They do not want to interfere. They may avoid interfering in the state affairs of Afghanistan. They could do that indirectly via Pakistan. But still, even Pakistan does not have or enjoy full control over the Taliban movement. China may have less opportunity to do that, ability to do that. Recognition may come. That is a possibility. But China alone, or even Russia and China together, would not make Taliban happy. They're after, or they want the recognition worldwide, and they want to get the seat of the, take over the seat of the Afghanistan at the UN General Assembly, which is very unlikely to happen if there is an opposition from the Americans or the British or the French.
Thank you. I have a question from Pierre D'Emilia, Sky TV 24. In your opinion, should Japan recognize the new government in Afghanistan?
Sorry?
Should Japan recognize the new government in Afghanistan?
Again, just like how we are going to relaunch our operations, assistance operations and cooperations in Afghanistan, until there is a really representative and inclusive government in Afghanistan, which is not going to force their ideas over the other population, other than the Taliban, with guns in their hands. Until that day comes, it's unlikely that this Japanese government or any Japanese government would recognize the Taliban as the official government in Afghanistan.
Thanks. Yes. Yes, Tom?
Thomas Sullivan, Koichiro, thank you very much.
No.
I just wanted to ask you about the Japanese humanitarian airlift over the last few days. I think the SDF aircraft just arrived in Kabul yesterday. It just seems to me that that was a little bit delayed. And also the Japanese were using Pakistani, airports as temporary kind of staging facilities or holding facilities. And I was just wondering if you could comment on that. Our understanding is that it's very difficult to get to the airport now. So is there a concern that maybe some of the Japanese or some of the Afghans who want to come here, Afghanis who want to come here, could be held as hostages? Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question, Tom. I perfectly agree to what you've said. There is a grave concern of how this operation is going to be conducted. Even though the C-130s may be able to fly into Kabul and be waiting on the tarmac for their passengers to be airlifted, there's a great. I mean, we've already seen reports that the Taliban were scaring away those Afghans who were wanting to come over to the airport and get a lift, get a ride. And so it's quite likely that there may be several flights in between, flights between Islamabad and Kabul International Airport. But in the end, few people would be capable of getting to the plane and being flown out. So the figures we've been hearing is roughly 500 with regards to the Afghan nationals who have been working for the embassy and for JICA and others. Even for that 500, including their families, immediate family members, I see that it's going to be terribly difficult for all these 500 personnel to get a flight on this Japanese air self-defense force C-130s.
There's other question from Piero D'Emilia, Sky TV. He talks about the lifting of Afghani people who cooperated with Americans and others. But he said, on the other hand, Japan, after having their 17 officials leaving to Qatar on a British military flight, have yet to bring back a single Afghani. A Jetai plane or Jetai plan has plane, I think, like Japanese. He says Jetai plan. I think it's plane has left to Qatar, but it seems that it's still unable to land in Kabul. How would you define this embarrassing situation?
I'm not quite sure about the conditions that is defined on the question over there. But C-2 did already land in Kabul airport, and C-130s are also capable in landing in Afghanistan airport. It's a matter of how to get the people to the airport and inside the airport. And there's a grave question, first over the security, secondly over how the Taliban are going to allow that to happen or not. And also the operations inside Afghanistan or in Kabul is extremely difficult because the embassy, the Japanese staff of the embassy had already been evacuated. So it's an operation that there is no operative center inside the city. Of course, in the airport or inside the airport, on the military quarter of the airport, there is a liaison of the self-defense forces, but they are not capable of identifying who is who. They are not capable of identifying how to organizing the land transport from their homes to the airport and how to get through the Taliban checkpoints. So it's a grave miscalculation, I'd rather say, if it hadn't been planned before. But regarding the question, I believe there's a misunderstanding of what is stated over there. The Japanese air self-defense forces had their air flights already into Kabul.
Thank you. We can, yes, Peter, go ahead.
I'd
like to ask another question based around your, another great game. We've seen the British, the Soviets, now the Americans and their allies sucked into Afghanistan. Can you see or envisage a situation where China might be drawn in a similar way because of the threat from instability in Xinjiang? And particularly noting that last year, I think it was, the Americans took the Eastern Turkestan Islamic movement off its terrorism list, which infuriated Beijing, of course. So do you see something else playing out here in terms of China, if things do worsen in Xinjiang with attacks, if they resurface, that China could be drawn in the way that similar past powers have been? Thank you.
It's an interesting question. Well, first of all, based on the patterns that the Chinese will act or react, I see less possibility that they would, launch sort of a military attack or intervention inside Afghanistan. It's unlikely that they would, they have the capacity to do that. Well, they could invade. But being, as you say, sucked into the quagmire of Afghanistan would just aggravate the situation. And it's likely that if they touch Afghanistan or if they invade Afghanistan, regardless of who they attack, the consequences would be much graver, meaning that any element inside Afghanistan or would be, say, supportive of the Afghan cause would support the EITMs or ATIMs or other separatist movements that may happen in or may exist inside China. And that is going to, like playing with fire and eventually get caught in fire at home. So I believe that the Chinese have already learned their lessons from the mistakes of the British, the Soviets, Russians, and the Americans, that it is no use for them to be there physically. They may want to squeeze or crush the elements that may have happened or that may have a hand in the terrorist attacks inside China via the Taliban movement, via Pakistan's influence. But I think that would be it. That's the limit. And also, referring to the ETIM, and yes, it's sort of an American tactic. Even though that in the case they know that the existence of the threat of the foreign terrorist organization does cause a threat, if they see that it is in their interest to counter other enemies, they take it off the list. In the case of Iran, the Mujahideen Halq was also taken off the list. Yeah.
Thank you. I received a question online from Philip Mesmer. He's a correspondent of Le Monde, a French newspaper. He asked, how do you assess the presence of so-called Islamic State, IS, in Afghanistan and its potential strength? Could it be a threat to or for Taliban rule? Ultimately, could IS, can it jeopardize efforts for international recognition of Taliban? That's it. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's another great question. The presence of IS is undeniable, or at least that there are elements that refer to themselves as the Islamic State of Khorasan Province, is ISK, or ISKP in acronyms. And we've already somehow witnessed a tragic event last night, if that is the actually caused by the IS. Or IS elements, and it is totally against, or they are totally against the Taliban, or the Taliban are against IS. So there's going to be a real conflict. I mean, not politically, moreover, a physical conflict, more fierce than any anti-Taliban element that you can think of, not from the Afghans, but I mean from the IS. It's going to be a threat for the Taliban move, and it's going to be a threat for any opportunity for the country to stabilize. If the Taliban is not strong enough, and if they are not capable of re-establishing a real order in their forces or under their command, then there will be multiple opportunities, or say countless opportunities for the insurgents like IS to operate and launch attacks against anything. I mean, whatever they want to, the Taliban or the population or any foreign NGO or any other elements that they wish to. So it is going to pose a real threat for the Afghans. Yeah.
My name is Kurt Sieber. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm an associate member here. My question is, it's a little bit delicate. To what extent has the United States position weakened by the way they have been leaving Afghanistan and by the way other countries in the past? And recent Japanese newspapers were talking in terms of a title, Japan is not Afghanistan. Thank you.
Yes. Well, thank you for the question. I don't think that is a delicate one. I think it's a real question. Thank you. Yes, I think there's a real debate here. I think people should be worried, but at the same time, there are fundamentalists here in Japan as well who consider that the U.S.-Japan alliance is stronger than ever, and that it is not going to be hurt or scratched by any sort of incident like this. I think both are right. I mean, people tend to believe, or those people who really support the U.S.-Japan alliance and also consider that as the vital surviving tool that we have in our hand in East Asia, it's sort of a nonsense for them to consider that Afghanistan is Japan or Japan is Afghanistan. That there could be any sort of a lessons learned from here. That we should not fall into the psychological trap that even the Chinese may be preaching towards Taiwan. So there's a strong belief in that part of the segment of the society or the political arena. But I mean, having said that, there is also a concern that we need to think of how we are going to strengthen or at least coordinate our efforts here in East Asia and the Pacifics with possibly the United States, definitely with the United States, but even states beyond that. I mean, like the Quad, India, Australia. I mean, individually we may think of how we are to operate, but how are we going to operate in terms of the foursomes or in the formulation of the Quad? I mean, that is to be considered, and also to be considered if the United States is not going to be the same United States that we have been counting for when the Quad was established, then what are we going to do? Are the rest of the three going to fill the vacuum of the United States?
Thanks. Let me ask a quick question before it's almost finished, but let me ask the last question. What's the influence of Qatar in these games of nations in Afghanistan? You know, Qatar hosted the talks between America and Taliban, and for more than a year. So it should like come a kind of agreement between America and Taliban, and suddenly America says like, oh, they took over and the government collapsed. It looked to some people like a conspiracy, hand over conspiracy. There is a wild conspiracy, of course, in the world. But what is Qatar like role now and influence, if any, in Afghanistan? Thanks.
Well, at least I can say, well, great question again, but at least I can say that Qatar's role, or the Qatari role in Afghan affairs is, well, greater than ever. I don't think that they, in the previous years, had that sort of an interest in dealing with the Afghan affairs. They got this opportunity mainly because of the United States. that they wanted a ground where the Taliban movement could establish a political office. And it could have been somewhere else, but if you look at the past history and also the geographical connection to Afghanistan, Pakistan was not a suitable location because of its direct relationship with the Taliban. And they already have a sort of well, the Pakistanis deny it, but they do have a presence inside Pakistan, like in cities in Quetta and Peshawar. So Iran is not a location that the United States wants. Central Asian states are not that suitable for any sort of a negotiation. And if you look at the Arab states, well, Saudi Arabia and UAE had recognized the Taliban government in the past, so again, they are off the list. And, well, Qatar was suitable, first of all, having a very close relationship with the United States, but also having displayed a foreign policy strategy that is quite unique from other Gulf Arab states. And I think that's one reason that Qatar got this, was accommodative for accommodating the Taliban movement. Now that they have this direct link, connection, and experience, they could, capitalize on this. Politically, not that much economically, but on economics. But politically and strategically, yes. But would they go into Afghanistan in the way that the Americans did, or even the United Arab Emirates or the Saudis did in the 90s? I doubt that. I think they would be more cautious on their initial approach. But still, they are sometimes a maverick in Gulf Arab affairs. It may be the first amongst the Arab states to recognize the Taliban as a formal government over there. But it may happen, but I don't think that is their intention at this moment. But one thing for sure, they will provide humanitarian assistance. They have been providing Hamas movement in Palestine over the years, following the encirclement of the Israelis and launching a blockade against the Gaza Strip. It was Qatar that had been providing assistance on humanitarian grounds to the Gaza Strip, people in the Gaza Strip. So the similar thing may happen. And they have, they are rich, they have the wealth, and they have the intention, and they have the experience, and also the channel to negotiate with the Taliban. And for that reason, I do believe that they are capable in playing a role, possibly a positive role. But I don't think that they are ready to jump the gun in recognizing the Taliban.
All right, thanks. They also capitalized in the media section. Their TV station was the only one joined the Taliban people to the palace, to the presidential palace. It was the only exclusive report.
Right.
So they gained a lot of attention in the media world. Thank you very much, Tanaka-san, for that. And I would like to provide you with 1 year honorary membership, so you can keep coming to our club and meet our members and exchange opinion around. Thanks again, and that's your. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you very much for coming, and for those watching online, thank you also, and everybody have a nice evening. Thanks.